Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us for the debate. When we planned with Jacqueline Côté the calendar of Ciné at IHEID, we decided to include this movie a couple of months ago, and I think it could not have been a better choice, especially because of what has been happening in terms of debates during the past month in Switzerland, in Europe, in the US, concerning the return of the jihadists, men and women. And curiously enough, I don't know if some of you yesterday night watched on television, on the Swiss television, the program related on Infrarouge, related exactly to the question of the return of the jihadists, echoes in a different way some of the problematic that were presented in that film. But basically, not going further, as the movie, the biopic documentary on the intellectual work of Professor Ould Mohamedou has been trying to explain, meaning that we are often dealing with technical issues and not the root causes of the radicalization. So I think that tonight the presence of Mahmoud, but also of our guest, will be important to develop a number of critical points. Just a quick introduction to our panelists. On my left, Mrs. Barbara Affolter, who is a senior advisor at the Swiss Development Cooperation Ministry of Foreign Affairs on issues related to violence prevention through development cooperation in countries outside Europe. Ben Davies, who is the filmmaker. This movie was produced by Al Jazeera, and Dan Davies, if you just go on his website, you will be amazed to see the quantity and quality of movies that he has produced on so different topics, by the way, because you worked on Syrian refugees in Greece, on the new African photography, on rebel architects, and then this series on youth radicalized. And last but not least, the protagonist of the movie, Ould Mohamedou. I'm very pleased and honored, actually, to chair this panel tonight because beside being a good colleague, Mahmoud is also an old friend. We met each other actually at the beginning of the 2000s. At the time he was teaching at Harvard, and I invited him at the Institute to give a talk about the work he was conducting at that time on Al-Qaeda. And there are many, the biography and the intellectual bibliography of Ould Mohamedou is very rich, but for the purposes of tonight's debate, it is worthwhile to recall his trilogy, which started with a book on the 11 September attacks, followed by a book on Al-Qaeda, and then a third, more recent book on ISIS. His contribution is really substantial, exactly, I would say, because he puts the fingers on the different variables that help explaining the processes of radicalization. So I will give you the floor, but say that we might count on 20-25 minutes for your presentations, and then we will give the floor a session of Q&A for questions. Mahmoud, I would give you the floor and let you a little bit express some of the main points that you have been working and you are working now in the present context of the debate on radicalization, please.
Thank you, Ricardo. Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank everybody for taking the time. Very happy to see Dan again after all of these months of traveling the world together and filming what you just saw. Thanking very much our colleague Ms. Gómez to join us this evening, and the important work she's doing at SDC with colleagues there. What can I say? I think that what really I probably would like to highlight is the fact that this is an adventure in which I embarked about a year ago. I think I was presenting my book at King's, and Dan kindly stepped in and we had a conversation, and one thing led to another. And I went into this for two reasons. One, as you pointed out, the quality of Dan's work, which is really Blackleaf Films. I think it's the kind of good investigative journalism, explaining, taking the time to try to tackle difficult topics. And I think that is something that we need more, and on a number of topics. We covered one this evening with that theme, but you can pick any topic, and I think that type of asking the right questions, you were saying, Ricardo, producing nuance in the way these things are approached, and also going into this open-endedly. It's a difficult set of questions. You're not in a demonstrative mode. You're not trying to sort of convince or something. You're asking questions. They may very well be pointed questions, but some of them we do not necessarily have the answer to. And I think this, I mean, the beauty in the title is that it is inviting a rethinking of something we think we have the keys to, and we don't. I think it's been almost 20 years soon with the 9/11 attacks that mark a certain rupture historically of a moment in which we find ourselves. And yet we, as I think we say in the documentary, we haven't solved any of this for sure. It's actually gotten worse in many ways. But I do believe that there is nothing inevitable, as I pointed out. And that's the glass half full aspect of it. There is a lot about this, which is about agency, what can be done about it, if we engage with the rethinking. The other reason why I went into this is also the fact that, again, Dan did the homework. That is something that was very important to me in this very impatient age where everybody has an opinion, not necessarily knowledge. The gentleman took the time to read the books, and we had long conversations, and this was prepared over time, and that was of interest to me. As it were, last year, I was thinking about doing myself a documentary with one of our PhD students here who has his own film companies in Brooklyn, New York. And he had approached me, and we started conversations about this. And so it was really in the nick of time that this materialized. So very much an invitation to rethink, as I said, and but also the quality of the craft that I think was enabled this, that you saw. Without the outtakes. A lot of that was also left due to time and negotiations with Al Jazeera. But you know more about this than I do. That's, yeah.
Thank you. Ben, I don't know why I've been keeping calling you Ben. Dan, sorry. Yeah, I mean, as far as I know from your production, this was the first biopic you engaged in, and following an intellectual university professor, I mean, developing through the movies his thought, its approach to a problematic, but then also following in while he's in the field, interviewing students, speaking to policymakers, etc. How was it, and what kind of difficulties you had in setting up this documentary?
Actually, it wasn't the first one that I did. I did a film called Give Us Back Our Data with Evgeny Morozov, who is the tech equivalent of Mahmoud.
On the Rebel Geeks? Was the Rebel Geeks?
Rebel Geeks, yes, Rebel Geeks. And so I think Mahmoud had seen that one. This was quite hard to do, actually. Nobody wanted to talk about radicalisation, and a lot of and to get those young people was a lot of work, and a lot more work than I think we thought. We thought that we could get a mixed a BME group together, and all the places that I approach that normally do this kind of thing, youth clubs or organizations, you know, I couldn't hide the fact that we were going to talk about radicalization. And as soon as that came up, even though we tried to explain we weren't in any way saying they were, they stopped replying to emails and stuff. So it was actually quite hard. In the end, we ended up getting the Finsbury Park Mosque, mainly because through working with Al Jazeera, I'd been in contact with them over that truck attack, and they did trust us. So they arranged those two guys, and then the University of East London sent out a press release that their students had done a documentary on the Prevent policy, which is in it. And I talked to their press officer, and finally there was somebody who understood what we were talking about, that there was an issue here, and he arranged those people. But as Dr. Mohamedou and I were on the Docklands Light Railway heading out to the University of East London, because it's a working class London university, most of the people there live in London with their parents and go there. They don't come. The tradition in Britain is you come from another town and stay in dormitories. So it's a long way out of London. They phoned to say, oh, everyone's dropped out. And this was really the last chance. Dr. Mohamedou was only in town for a few days, and I just said, well, find someone, we're coming. And so those guys were rounded up from the library with no briefing. And one guy, the guy that said he didn't think, Dr. Mohamedou pulled him off the little campus outside and dragged him in. And he kept saying, I have to go. And we're like, no. But it shows you how close it is to the surface, that they didn't need any prepping. I mean, I will say that we had done some background, and I did a long interview with a psychoanalyst who works a lot with Muslim, particularly communities, and she said that she can't talk to me on camera or have any of her people because they would run a mile. But she gave us the right questions to ask, because when I started talking about the kind of things that we wanted, she said, oh, I've spent months trying to get that out of people. And we were like, oh, God, how are we going to do this in half an hour? But Dr. Mohamedou turned out to be a great interviewer, and all that stuff just came out. I mean, we could have done the whole 20 minutes, whole 25 minutes of them and not got bored. They were incredible. They were so eloquent and understood exactly what was happening. And then so one of the things that I have to do in taking the work of someone like Dr. Mohamedou is to try and hack it down and away, and there's whole swathes of sections from the Theorizing ISIS book, which I loved, but just couldn't make it in, because TV is a bit like going up a trench. It's linear, it's time-based. You have to start on a subject, keep going, build a case very slowly, and you don't really have time to go, oh yeah, but also just think that no, you can't do that, because you lose your audience. So yeah, I've lost my train of thought.
Thank you, Danny. For the sake of the debate tonight in the panel, we also thought important to have a Swiss specialist, or I would say more than a specialist, a policymaker of the Swiss Development Cooperation, who works on violence prevention and violence or preventing radicalization in countries where the Swiss Development Cooperation is active. Meaning that I think that your view or the experience of your work is complementary to the questions that are raised by the radicalization here in Europe.
Thank you. Good evening. Well, I'm wondering, what can I say to this film or to this subject? First of all, Dan, I understand somehow that nobody wants to talk about radicalization with you. I mean, honestly, I think radicalization is not the problem. And I mean, you live in a city where a very important party is called Les Radicaux. And we had also this feedback from our field offices. The Swiss Development Corporation has in our partner countries, we have field offices. And when we were talking about the subject of prevention of violent extremism, which is definitely a topic for us, then people said, but stop to talk, to say that radicalization is so bad. No, I think that being radical is not the problem. The problem is being violent. And that's why I think, you know, I'm coming from communication. I was in a former life, I was journalist. I'm working a lot also within our programs with strategic communication. And I think we should be very, very careful about our words. And you, in the film, it was also said, you know, that sometimes these stereotypes, they come from the communication, they come from the terminology. And I think this is a very, very important point. We see also, if we talk with our colleagues, let's say from Middle East or West Africa, then of course they also have to deal with this Swiss foreign policies, which says that yes, it is important to prevent violent extremism, but it is absolutely a problem to talk about that in these countries. I mean, you cannot pronounce the word extremist, of course. And this is why I think we should really be very careful about how we communicate. Radicalization as such is not the problem. I think if we want to identify a challenge, a real problem, then it might be more the fundamentalism which can be religious, which can be political, and from the fundamentalism, the step towards violence. And I think there we are really at the core of the issue. And what we also detect as development actors, when we look worldwide, I mean, we don't work only in countries where you have the so-called violent extremism, always in a relation, I mean, without speaking it loud, but thinking about jihadism. No, we are really meeting other kind of violences. If we look, for example, closer to a country where we work in, which is Mali, then, oh yes, it's a big problem, the violent extremism. If we look at it really, then we see we have maybe ethnic conflicts, we have conflicts between peasants and herders. So we have how do you say, a paysage of conflicts, a blanket of conflicts, and then you can, of course, ideologically, you can put the violent extremism on that. And I think this doesn't lead us far. Maybe I could say some words about how we understand prevention, because, of course, as I said, prevention of violence is the issue. And if we look, for example, at a country like Honduras, where we have a strong program, you look at extreme violence. And of course, then if you want to, as a researcher, if you want to analyze what is the origin of this violence, then you see absolutely the same patterns as if you look at violent extremism in a so-called jihadist context. So in this sense, we should really look at the big blanket, as you say. And prevention, in this sense, what does that mean? Switzerland is working in mostly in fragile context with development cooperation. So for us, poverty, you can only reduce poverty if first you address the conflicts. And conflicts is understood in a very broad sense. Maybe you are familiar with freedom from fear thematic, which is a part of the human security. Conflict does also mean exclusion. Conflict means if you have no legal certainty, if you suffer from corruption. These are elements of conflicts, and we think this is our Swiss development policy, that first we have to address all these kind of conflicts before you can really make a successful poverty reduction. Prevention in this sense is in a way development cooperation, it is strengthening human rights, it is struggling for inclusion, for social cohesion, as it was said, of course, in your film. But we also realize, of course, that there is quite a strange idea of prevention in the air. And we heard it, this prevent of UK. You know, this is, recently we had a cold phone with our office in Tunis. We were talking about civil society organizations with whom we would work on prevention of conflicts and on human rights. And then our colleague told us, oh yes, you know, we have also civil society organizations. They understand prevention as detect and report. So this would be what we would call countering violent extremism, and this is absolutely out of question that from our development perspective, Switzerland would be active in this issue.
Thank you. Yes, Mahmoud, you want to?
Thank you. Now, just to follow up on that, I think that one of the things that is really at the heart of this conversation is precisely that we find ourselves in a moment in history in which what was just described in terms of the problems of language, the problems of policies, I think is at a dead end. And my main concern with this is that there was a lot of frustration, that I saw a whole generation coming up, professionals, and they seem to be taking a certain narrative, and it's not even a political narrative, it's just kind of a lazy narrative of a reductionist approach as fait accompli, as something that actually possibly could work. The first layer is what you described, which is about the terminology, radicalization, extremism, violent extremism, fundamentalism. There's a whole family of issues there that I used to speak jihadism, which is specific to radical Islamism. Sort of a whole series of terms that are bandied about and used interchangeably without much science, without much history, without much difference. And I think that's one line that is problematic to the professional, particularly to the development ones. And I've met enough development professionals that have felt very frustrated. They had invested decades of work in building ties with communities and engagement. Educators, Laverne was brilliant in what she said and what we met with her. This is literally putting pressure, and the other gentleman, about educators having to live up to a series of political agendas that they don't share. It's frustrating. And as Dan interjects to the gentleman, a lot of this is actually describing youth in its normal frustrations. I mean, how is that different from radical, violent extremism youth, which also exist, and we've seen that. So this whole series of issues, Ricardo, I think, was very problematic then. But there's another sub-theme in the film that I also was very interested in highlighting, and I think it comes across. We worked a bit with that on Dan, which is the other dimension of the forward-looking aspect, which is the stuff in the city, which is the stuff about security, about surveillance, about this violence that travels. It is in Tunis one day, it is in Cairo, then it's in Lagos, but it's also in London, and it's also in New York. And I think this aftermath of ISIS. ISIS is an excuse to have this conversation. Their story is very self-contained, but their story is very much part of a global moment, which it is actually has accelerated. So what is arresting to us historically as people looking at political violence from the 60s and 70s and 80s and all of these stories is to be able to have that level of inquiry, which we haven't had. And I think that is from the scientific point of view, more than the policy one, actually, the frustration that comes more sort of vividly, at least for me.
I just wanted to pick up on that because what you're saying about the violence traveling to the cities and going all over the world, and I think, and I speak particularly for the Western world because obviously there's a whole section of Dr. Mohamedou's work about the developing world, but and to the extent that this film concentrates more on the developing world, you know, the overwhelming sense of threat as Dr. Laverne said, the first thing she says is threat is all around us. The woman in the university said, you know, in this culture of fear, and they said a lot more of that. You know, when you're editing, you try and have people say things once so it doesn't get boring, but they were, you know, that was a big thing for them. And then also, you know, the guy in the mosque who fears himself, basically. And particularly in somewhere like London, you know, I don't know how we got here, but that's a long discussion, but psychologically, I think we're at a place where people are very fragile, and you know, there's a knifing crisis in London going on. Well, if these people feel like that, and they're quite successful people at university, how do you think a 12-year-old feels going out on the street? And so this is, you know, I think is becoming an epidemic, and I think it's not going to go until we stop. So now in London, they're going, oh, how can we stop the gangs? And you're like, come on, look, the 12-year-old's not in a gang. He's just scared, and he had a knife, and it went wrong. But yeah, I mean, in terms of dealing with that, I think we have to dial back on the paranoia and the anxiety that people are feeling.
Yeah. Before giving the floor to the public, I just would like to add one point that the movies shows well directly and indirectly, because when we talk about radicalized youth and violence and non-state armed actor, we usually tend to forget that Western states are part and parcel of a global form of state terrorism that has been implemented in various regions of the world. Think to what has been the Vietnam War and the implication of the US. Think to what has been the 10 years of civil war in Algeria and the implication of the French intelligence and the military. Think to what happens in Gaza. Think to what happens in different parts of the world where state repression has been growing up, increasing, and state repression manifests not only through military or police repression, but in different forms of symbolic and material marginalization of entire bunch of peoples in the name of A, B, C, and D interest. So your documentary was hinting a different aspect and how they are correlated, what the impact of the action, no matter if you like or not Gaddafi, but what happened in Libya and the consequences of that are extremely important for what we are talking about. How are they considered, how they are analyzed, what bridges are made, not only by policymakers, but also by us as academicians or whatever. So there is a real lack. Please, the floor is yours. Maybe we can take a number of questions, 2, 3 questions. There is a question over there, so that you can answer.
Hello. Hi. First, just please excuse my ignorance about the Swiss system, Barbara. But you work within the Department of Foreign Affairs, but are you also policy advisor to an extent for the national arena on how to work with these issues?
No, I don't have nothing to do with national policy work. I'm the Swiss Development Agency is part of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, but of course we have a special mandate, and that's why I say when I speak I have the development perspective, which means that our objective is, if you want so, the reduction of poverty and also the reduction of conflicts, as I explained. But we are not linked, you know. I mean, Mr. Cassis, which is our foreign minister now, he says that, of course, foreign policy is domestic policy, but this does not mean that we are working also directly for the domestic policies.
Because then I have a follow-up question to that. Well, first of all, thanks for a fantastic showing here and a very interesting discussion. But in the documentary, you go and talk both to the national policymakers and show the problems about securitization of the national agenda, but also speak about solutions on the foreign affairs. But I'm Swedish, and these past few months, it's been big discussions in news media about the difficulty of integrating ISIS returnees back home, whereas I have so many friends that work with doing the same thing and many programmatic experiences of it abroad. But all of those experiences seem so foreign to the national. So I'm wondering if you could share some thoughts perhaps as to how to find synergies between what you are doing for the foreign affairs side of it with the national arena and working against radicalization.
Well, in effect, it's really another business what we are working in the sense that we are working. It's maybe interesting if I start from another angle. You know, it's nice. It's nice that you are from Sweden. It is like a coincidence, maybe, but Sweden and Switzerland, we might be the unique countries, not only in Europe, but donor countries, which have quite a clear policy regarding the prevention of violence in abroad, in our partner countries. Because what we see in the field is that, for example, well, I don't mention names. This would not be nice, and I'm not a diplomat, but I should be diplomatic as well. But of course, we see that a lot of other donor countries, they don't make this clear separation between development policy and security policy. And so for them, you have other countries who say that development policy is security policy. We, as Switzerland, we would never say this, but of course we are also, like Sweden, a neutral country. And for us, we separate really the development objectives and the security objectives. And security objectives has nothing to do with within our development policy. So in this sense, Sweden and Switzerland are really like-minded. But what I can say is that more and more other countries, they have really another policy now, also abroad. Sometimes they mix it really also up, security policy with development policy. And in our eyes, of course, this can be a problem. And this is when I may promote a little bit the Swiss development cooperation. This is also, how do we say, this is a value added of Switzerland. So we can often work in regions where other donors could not. I mean, let's name Afghanistan, because Afghanistan, you have a lot of countries, they are there with military and everything, and Switzerland, we really try to separate this.
Yes, other questions? There is a question over there.
Hello, my name is Mohamedou. I'm a first-year MIA student, and my question is for Professor Mohamedou. So I've been engaging in some research on specifically radicalization in Europe and North America, and through this research I came up to a hypothesis, which was that, so we were talking about this face of terrorism, which is propagated by the media, and oftentimes it is of a Muslim man or someone who is not white, basically, and does not have a Christian name. And so what I came up with was the thought that the very countries that the journalism in these kind of countries that are engaged in war in the Middle East, it would make sense for the media to portray pretty much all terrorists in those countries as Muslim, because it would somehow provide some legitimacy to, say, the US or France or any country that is bombing Syria in the name of the fight against ISIS. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find any sort of literature on this. I was wondering if you could maybe answer that.
Please.
Thank you, and good luck with your work. I think it's important work and it's needed. I really mean what I said earlier, that I think we're at the cusp of a new phase of research in which this generation will need to complexify, add layers. Look, this whole discussion is all about the grayish and the nuance. It's very important to establish the fact, as we do in the documentary, that the lead terrorist groups, and there is such thing as terrorism and there is such thing as terrorists. You know, there's a whole semantic discussion, but one can approach that definition with a lot of qualifications, but we can't go there. The lead groups over the past 20 years have been obviously Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, the Islamist State. So this is not something that is about denying that and as a historical moment. But as we said earlier, there are other moments in history where that face that you described would be of a different color, of a different face, you know, even ideologically. So the green is dominant one now, but the red, the communist one in the 1970s, or the extreme left wing and so on. So it's very important to historicize this evolution, not be stuck as we have been over the past 20 years with one single incarnation, which is the latest incarnation. Having said that, the terms are generic terms. They cannot be associated with the latest incarnation. If something is radical, it could be radical from anywhere, anytime, any different configuration. To move to an extreme position and to become violently extremist, as has been discussed, could also be by any number of such actors. So the difficulty in this discussion is to remove that which we have been stunned into practicing, not even believing. I don't even think that it's conspiratorial. I think, as I said, that is simply where we are. We have to step back from that and see what the larger problem is as such. By the way, the most recent studies, late January, Center for Radicalisation actually is about right-wing terrorism, as you might have seen. And there's a steady pattern emerging since last year already. That's why I speak in the discussion and in the book more than in the documentary of the post-ISIS phase, in which I think we're already in there. And that is going to be much more hybrid, much more global, much more both Western and Eastern, any number of ideology, possibly even apolitical, with the last set of images in the documentary that Dan put together shows you discomfort globally, North and South. I think that's one of the points. Now, to your research, it's not surprising that there's not much there. I think what I wanted to add to what our colleague was saying is that I met a lot of these development workers that felt frustration because the development work was, to your question, Anton, has been kind of hijacked by a lot of people that are saying this is what has to be done, this is the approach, and in so doing, taking a concept which is very technocratic now, CVE, PVE, all of those things that have emerged as acronyms with very well-meaning people, but it doesn't necessarily convey a sense of a specific problem as opposed to everything that is relatively familiar under the sun in terms of frustrations, development, discrimination, violence itself, radical violence, terrorism. Do we necessarily need new concepts for that? I doubt that. And to the media, yes, they have not helped. That's true. But so what? I mean, the media do that on many other topics. We shouldn't be simply focused on the faulty narrative of the media. There's also good journalism out there. There's plenty of things that you can get the information and independent sources and so on. But the fact is that to a large extent, we're guilty of buying into that narrative. And that's the difficult part of it. That being bamboozled by stuff that is scary, that is about violence, we have enabled, I think, the materialization of that narrative. And I think it is a conscious effort that we need to make to divorce ourselves from that. And I think that will be helped more by more knowledge, but more discussions, by having an honest look at that. And I think it's starting, frankly. I think that the tide is turning. I think we will see more such work. And maybe what you will produce will add to that. So certainly good luck with that.
Yeah, there are other questions there. There are 3 questions. Maybe we take the 3 questions. By the way, what you hinted at, Mahmoud, I think that since the 50s, in the post-World War II, if there has been a key problematic issue, at least on the side of Western states, is how politics and the policy of diplomats has has often been contradicting with the policy of development policymaker and humanitarian policymaker, and the lack often of how the political process accompanies what is done at another level, or rendering development and humanitarian aid as fig leaves in the absence of clear political decision-making. Yes, there were 3 questions around.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I've been studying a human security course at Sciences Po Paris, and I've been working on Russian counterterrorism strategy, especially in Chechnya region. And in that regard, I have a question. Since from the human security perspective, we should address terrorism issues with a context-specific framework, how can we elaborate the only plan to fight violent extremism and terrorism globally? It seems to me, since I've been working on Chechnya, it's a very particular region in Russia, I would say that it's almost impossible to have a unique strategy for every country in the world, because it depends really on the specific situation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My question is, to what extent are these security policies well, maybe designed intentionally or not, but to perpetuate misleading stereotypes and narratives of terrorism, which in turn enable and justify abusive security policies and also give green light to authoritarian regimes to double down on these abusive security policies, which in turn feeds the cycle of violence. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. So my question may sound very simple, but once we have identified this narrative in the media, we have seen since post 9/11, shall we say, what means do you see? What should we do? How could we convey a counter narrative to it? Because it seems to be quite difficult, if not impossible, to master the imaginary of billions of people on the planet. So what means, apart from an Al Jazeera documentary of 25 minutes, what other means do we have at a national, if not an international level? What could we do to create this kind of counter narrative? And with what funds, or what specifically, which agencies do you have in mind?
Thank you. I think there are 3 very interesting questions, and all of you have. Let's begin by ladies first, and we can.
Yes. The question about sorry, no, I have my own. Sorry, I just forgot it. Thank you. The question about what you said, an overall anti-terrorist strategy, and of course, I mean, this is absolutely nonsense, because when we have learned one lesson, then that each conflict is really very context specific. And experts working, for example, in specific countries in Africa, they even say that the reason of the conflict, of getting violent, can change from from one region to another, you know, even from one village to another. So when we really want to make very effective policies or strategies how to address this violence, then of course this is really number one. You have to be absolutely context specific. You have to analyze your context. The context means the political context, the economic, the environmental, but also, and this is something that often is forgotten, you have also to analyze the individual, the psychosocial context of the people living there, because they are people, they have lived specific things, they are traumatized, they have bad experiences, and if you don't address this, then you will never be able to make an effective, well, let's say, yes, I don't dare to say a counterterrorism strategy, because there we would be more in a prevention strategy. And then I come to what you said about the security policy. I don't know if some of you might maybe know this study which has been made by UNDP last year. It's called A Journey to Extremism in Africa. And this is really a very, very interesting study. It has been made by interviews with ex-fighters. They made the interviews in prisons and so on.
It was coordinated by one of our former students of the Institute, Reda Ben Kiran, is the one. Yeah.
Okay, so all of you know it.
For the Institute,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, so I did not know that, but it's really a very interesting study. And what this study brings to light, something which we knew, but now we have really the figures, you know, that abuses of security forces is like the #1 trigger for violence. And this is the case, let's say, in Middle East, in West Africa, and this is also the case when I always like to speak about Honduras, you know, because there you have another context, but also the fact that in your family, your father has been maybe killed by police, or this individual history of vulnerability is often comes from abuses by the security forces. We know that, and in this sense, of course, the accountability of security forces is like the #1 counterterrorism methodology, I would say.
Thank you.
To the Chechnya point first, I think to look at it in the whole and to steal some of Dr. Mohamedou's best lines, which is that we have to appreciate how things are changing. You know, about 100 years ago, Britain was able to rule India with a few thousand people. Now, America couldn't hold Iraq with goodness knows how many thousand troops. Something's fundamentally changed, and people are mad as hell, and they're not going to take it anymore, quite simply. And that goes, I think, for, you know, from Chechnya to Scotland to people in Britain on the internet. There's a big debate going on in Britain because people at universities are saying, we don't want this fascist coming to speak to our university. And a lot of people are saying, oh, this is the end of free speech. And you're like, actually, no, it's just that everyone else is using their own free speech and you don't have a right to say things and not deal with the consequences. And so I think it's in that context that we need to understand that there's, we're not going to be able to design things that put the genie back in the bottle, basically. I don't know if that helps. It doesn't help with Scotland. We don't know what to do with Scotland. Are they going? Are they staying? But they're pretty mad and they hate us, so. And then feeding the cycle of violence. Well, funnily enough, I've been talking about another documentary with an investigative journalist, Anthony Lowenstein, who did a book, Disaster Capitalism, and has just done a book on the war on drugs. And it was going to be linking the war on terror and the war on drugs. and he can prove quite concisely that the war on drugs has been a self-perpetuating war. Drugs got worse wherever they went, drug production went up, but a lot of companies did extremely well. And he found this office, I shouldn't tell you this because this is documentary gold. There's an office in Washington where these two things come together, and it doesn't even have its own nameplate, but billions of dollars go through it, and it links the war on drugs and the war on terror. But, so yes, I don't know about the war on terror, but certainly the war on drugs, it's quite conclusively provable that it is a cycle that drives itself. And the counter-narratives, I mean, I think that comes back to people are mad as hell. There's a whole, you know, we don't just have the broadcast media or the print media anymore. I think the next step, though, is that you will have new architectures built. Google, Facebook, you know, in the quest to clamp down on what they see as extremist speech, they're taking a lot of other people into that net. And I think you're going to have to build those imaginaries in a different infrastructure.
There's actually another colleague who's written a book recently about from the war on drugs to the war on poverty and onto terrorism subsequently. So this is definitely absolutely linked. And I think to your point that it hasn't worked, I think this is the question that shows that the whole 9/11 period has failed in the sense that this is the first question we start the documentary, why is this continuing as such? So thank you for your questions. The one on Chechnya, I think, has been addressed mostly. I'd say, of course, context. It's absolutely important, and that is why these grand schemes of violent extremism and so on don't necessarily give you the keys to go into the specificities and so on. Not that you cannot have concepts that will help you navigate, but you nonetheless need to bring them back to the context and to the history. Because obviously, as you very well know, Chechnya will take you into at least 2 wars and into policies in Russia itself, in the capital and elsewhere. So I think a combination of context and history, and that's also what's a lot of this thing is missing. It's very much technocratic, as I said. You read these reports and they're very bland, and they speak in this language that you could slap one matrix from Nairobi to I don't know, Minneapolis, and literally, and except the only thing that stays the same as we're describing is the face of the culprit, which is brown and black and wearing a veil and et cetera, et cetera. And that whole thing is becoming also problematic, that we don't necessarily actually ask it, but it is definitely there. So I think for those elements are there. Thank you for raising the question of authoritarianism. I think this is the big paradox of how in the global south the security narrative was used in the 2000s to give an extra lease to authoritarian regimes that were dying, in effect, pre-Arab Spring. And so right after 9/11, throughout that decade, they were able to say, see, we told you, those are our enemies, the terrorists, they are your enemies, and so on. And after 10 years, you realize that the youth we saw in Morocco, for instance, had other things on their mind, which is basically to have a normal life and to secure a job and so on. And so that led to that. Still, where we are today is a bouncing back of that authoritarian state, where you see a lot of this neo-authoritarian game and connecting, and in fact, strangely enough, influencing back the authorities in the north that look increasingly themselves authoritarian. The crisis of democracy in Europe, what you see across Asia, Brazil, the US, there is a strange game of mirroring of that effort that we see, and that is very troublesome to the democrats of this world, and I think we're right in the middle of that wave. Don't shoot the messenger. You know, yeah, literally, and don't discount the importance of a 26-minute documentary by Al Jazeera, because it actually can work wonders. It's really it's up to you what you're prepared to do. What us in that sense can produce: knowledge, engagement, debate for sure, research. We've spoken about that. Calling for better leadership on these questions. I think we suffered globally from a lot of lousy leadership when it came to very existential questions throughout this whole 20 years, and we were taken down the road of securitization, as was mentioned, blindly, but also, and I think we shouldn't cast the stone so easily, ourselves walking that path. And finally, I think also most importantly, in terms of things that could change, I will say that I see you can always have good leadership and you could have all solid research, but that one thing that I see increasingly in my work influencing people a lot more comes from actually art. Art. Things that are going beyond the confines of academia, novels and films and paintings, and those things that speak to our emotions and songs and you name it. Those things that are slightly on the side, that are not usually used in our world here of academia, I think they can work wonders in pointing out to people, like with one painting, with one girl and a stain on a wall, and you could basically speak civil rights to a whole generation, right? The same thing, I think, is what we need to have. And I was saying to a journalist recently, we were doing a podcast, I say, where's the big film these days about 9/11? Like we have Apocalypse Now on Vietnam, right? You watch that, you get it immediately, right? As opposed to 20 years where you don't have a big piece of art that is so powerful that we get it and it inspires. But I think we're getting there. I think this narrative, as we were describing, is really now tired. It's not working anymore. And when you say all of these movements across the world, whether they're on the right wing, Gilets jaunes type, or on the left wing, that of some others, Podemos and Ciudadanos, whatnot. I think Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street. I think we have a moment, right? The Arab Spring, obviously, we have a moment of pushback, and that's not finished. It may not be, might not have been successful, but I think that is going to stay for a while, and I think that's where we have to tap in to change the narrative and not expect that someone comes and does it for us. Whether they be the media or someone else. But it's a lot of work. But I really think that we're the beginning of this. And when you say it first, you seem like you're crazy and this is not happening. 15, 20 years from now, you might be a voice amongst the wilderness when it becomes so systemic that this has been sort of entered into the normality of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmoud. I know that you have imperatively to leave the room by 8, so it is 8 o'clock. I say that with a little bit of frustration, and I think part of the public would have liked to keep the conversation going on. And I sincerely thank the three of you for all the food for thoughts you have been giving us. And I thank you very much again for your participation.